Well, we've mentioned, but we haven't really talked about Iran, um, which actually started a fundamentalist combination of political power and religious power, which was unprecedented for hundreds of years in the world in 1979. And many would compare essentially the playbook of what they did with a spectacular media event, the embassy hostage crisis, to the beheadings of ISIS, grabbing of territory, means of sustenance, weapons, recruiting people to their cause, and trying to elbow out of the way any rivals. A similar playbook. Do we have a similar concern about the way this regime has acted for 37 years?
Yes, in 1979, they turned back the tide of history, which up until then was rolling towards modernity. And when that happened, you know the consequences for so many Persians, the tragic consequences once that happened in 79. But that also then spurred that theocracy, then spurred the actions of the Wahhabi institutions, clerics, to come to the decision, well, then we need to compete with that, and maybe that's the way to do it. So Iran has its permanent revolution to extend the Shia crescent, and now we have the Deobandi schools, for example, West Africa, East Africa, Central Asia, pushing off the concept, selling this concept that fundamentalism or confrontation, this is the way to spread the faith. And as a consequence of that, you now have changed the culture, as explained to me by moderate Muslims, like the governor of the province where Boko Haram is now. I remember him telling me, we've got this consequence, this blowback, where there's a new madrasa, the new code is confrontational, it's very radical, and eventually they'll come for me because they're going to consider me an apostate. They're turning the clock back. So as the clock was turned back by the Ayatollah, so was it turned back by the clerics in their efforts. So all of this is a consequence. And as to the way we've handled it, our mistake, I think, has been the tilt to Iran by the administration should have been in 2009 to the tilt to the people who had the election stolen from them in Iran. The great irony is that the Gallup polling shows that 2/3 of the people in Iran wanted a Western-style democracy without a theocracy. But because of the power of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has nationalized the assets, they now have superimposed over them this entity which becomes ever more powerful.
Much has been said about the nuclear agreement, and I don't intend to use precious time rehashing that. But in the heat of the congressional discussion of it, the president said, look, we were only trying to stop Iran's pathways to the bomb. That was our sole focus. And I beg to differ because if you go back to his UNGA speech for the leaders of the world in September of 2013, he had a much more expansive future vision that these talks could lead to a new understanding based on respect. And he reached out. And if I read the body language of the administration in the last 2 years, it has been more a quest for rapprochement and détente, and not just stopping, not just the terms of the JCPOA. I wonder if you agree with me on that. And the real question is, number one, is there any merit in pursuing rapprochement and détente with the regime as you understand it? And number two, in the light of the elections we've just been hearing about, the parliamentary and Assembly of Expert elections, where there was a reform slate that did well in Tehran, and people are excited about that. I've heard that hit record a few times now, under Rafsanjani and Khatami, and now Rouhani, and now the Tehran elections. Does this offer genuine hope to address what you just said, which was the turning back the tide of modernity around the world?
Well, first, let's recognize what happened in those elections. because in the first round of elections, the submissions were made by the Greens and by the reformers who had the election stolen in 2009. Those candidates were not allowed to run. So the election was actually between the hardliners in Iran and the hardliners in Iran. And so at the end of the day, every one of those candidates was picked by the Ayatollah. All right? So regardless of the outcome of that, the fact remains, and this is like an East German election. I was on an exchange program years ago, and they were explaining, oh yeah, we have 7 different parties. Yeah, but the same guy picks the candidates for all 7 parties. So yeah, you have an election, but it's that kind of a circumstance. I wanted to explain that. And second, we have not broadcast into Iran or with social media done the things in 2009 that really would have bolstered the people who are basically disenfranchised. And the other observation I would just make is that we are seemingly not having success in changing the attitude of the Ayatollah, because the last speech I saw ended with, death to the little Satan, death to the great Satan. And those usually aren't the words of someone who you're making progress with, especially after he's finished the sentence, and this was actually some months ago, but it's the responsibility of every military man to figure out how he can help us mass produce ICBMs. Now, you might have thought that, well, maybe that's a massive space program, except he put on the side of the last 2 that they launched off, Israel must be destroyed, and, he does it in Hebrew. I just don't see how they're telegraphing the punch to say anything other than, look, these are our intentions, and given that, I do not think now, after all we've done, that adding them and giving them access to the U.S. dollar so that they can further stabilize their regime, they want to be able to go through our financial system here and have the ability to basically dollarize or boost the value of their currency, because their currency value is. If we allow them that, again, the beneficiary will be the entities that have nationalized it. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's in charge of the ballistic missile program. So this is the conundrum we're in right now.
Well, yesterday, I think, the State Department issued its annual human rights report. And you won't get me started on the different stovepipes that give you a foreign policy view through the lens of one special concern or another. But yesterday, it was the Human Rights DRL's turn, and Secretary Kerry presided over it. I just want to read you something Secretary Kerry said. I think he was talking about ISIS and Syria, but we've been talking about Iran. He said, and I quote, "Some look at these events and fear democracy is in retreat. In fact, they are a reaction to the advance of democratic ideals, to rising demands of people from every culture and region for governments that answer to them," unquote. That's in the preface to the Human Rights Report that just was issued. How does that relate to U.S. policy on Iran?
Well,
which was one of the 5 most egregious violators cited by the State Department yesterday.
If we look at the number of people put to death, political prisoners, in Iran last year, it was much higher than the year before.
It averages 3 a day, I believe.
It's a number which is going up, and if we speak for a minute about the hostage situation, they've just taken another American hostage, and when his dad was sent over to plead for him, now he and his father are in Evin prison, which, by the way, is the worst prison you want to be in. So the human rights attitudes in Iran are different among the general populace than they are among those who believe in the Shia revolution. If you believe in the Shia revolution and you're dealing with apostates, and they're trying to disseminate, let's say, their faith, then their fate is to lose their lives. And this should be understood, I think, by our policymakers and by the American people. Well, this is what we're dealing with.
As we look ahead to whoever comes next in the executive branch, I think the question I would ask you is, when you look at everything we've just discussed, Iran's help to Syria, Iran's role in Iraq, Iran's language, Iran's post-JCPOA activity, is this evidence that they are on the march? Or alternatively, are these the actions of a regime that's worried about the ground underneath their own feet? We look at 2009, we look at the amount of executions, and even the fact that they came to the table to try to get sanctions lifted, but didn't really buy the rapprochement.
My concern is that theocracies are in the grip of an obsession with not only trying to compel compliance by their own people, but also trying to expand their influence. And you see this with their attempt. Yemen, that was an ally of ours, that was overthrown. There were 200 Quds forces involved in helping the Shia militia down there, the Houthi militia. You look at the attempts to overthrow the government in Bahrain. Now Israel faces on its border Quds forces out of Iran, and you watch their activity, including their efforts to spread their influence, their ballistic missile program. And I think, as I said before, Ambassador, we need a very real plan to do what we did with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Eastern Europe. We need to broadcast in to the Persian people, and the Azeris in that country, a steady amount of information on universal human values, on human rights, and explain what's actually going on day to day inside that country, and see if it doesn't have the same impact it had in Poland or in East Germany.
It is illegal to have satellite dishes, and I've seen pictures of tanks rolling over them.
I know, but there's also social media. There's so many ways for us to get information into that society if we have the will to do it. And what I don't want to see is a circumstance where we view that as confrontation. It is not confrontation to disseminate ideas. Free speech should never be a confrontational concept. The ideal of us putting out these values when we know that that is what worked in the past, we are entirely too reticent to pick up the cause of those who are being killed, those who are being tortured and have in prison, and tell their story on the air. Iranians are interested in this. Their social media. Find new ways to get into that social media with the facts on a day-to-day basis. Take young Persians who have left the country, who want to do this, like once young East Germans and young Poles did it. They have their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the country, and let them tell the story of what's going on around the world as well. But let's have a narrative that competes with the Ayatollahs. I think it's vitally important.